Hello, my name is Carrie and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in January. So back in January, I started off the year actually really strong. I read 11 books and that was about 3,000 pages. Of those 11 books, 8 of them were audiobooks, 2 were physical books, and 1 was an ebook. 7 of those books came from the library. 1 of them was an ARC that I received and 3 were from my owned TBR, which is actually so shocking to me that I read 3 whole books from my physical TBR. Now onto the author backgrounds. 70% of the authors that I read from were white, 20% were Asian, and 10% were Black authors. My average rating for the month was kind of shocking to me because when I look back on the books that I read in January, I think pretty highly of them, but my average rating was a 2.95. And I'm gonna get into maybe why I was a little bit harsher with my ratings through the month, because as I was kind of reflecting on these a little bit more in depth for this video, I realized that, yeah, there were a few that I really did not enjoy. And of course, I'm gonna get into that when I start doing my mini reviews of the books. But back to some statistics. The countries that I read from for this month were the United States, Taiwan, Japan, Nigeria, which was a pretty wide variety for me. Although 3 of them are coming from Asia, this still does not mean that I'm reading enough from like Latin America, Central South America. But I am glad that there's not as many represented from Europe. And I also had 2 DNFs in January. The first one is Fire in Every Direction, which I just remembered. I don't know the authors of either of these 2 books. I will obviously insert a picture so that you can see for sure. This was an ARC that I received for review and I just didn't really get on with the writing style. It's a memoir about the author's experience as a queer Palestinian growing up both in Palestine and also in the United States, I believe. The writing style was just not resonating with me. It was a little bit more like a blend of literary fiction and nonfiction, and that is just a very difficult sell for me. And then the second one was I Contain Multitudes. This one, I had a love-hate relationship. I have been reading it for like 6 months, and it's just so long and rambling. There were like a lot of interesting anecdotes in this, but I think there's a lack of a cohesive arc throughout the book that really ties it together into something that I feel like reflects a broader understanding of microbiomes, which is what this book is about. It's like the history of the microbiome and why it's important, mostly in animals, but also some anecdotes are about humans as well. And yeah, it's just not something that I found myself enjoying. And I only had like an hour left of the audiobook, but truly even that I just could not finish. I had been putting it off for like 2 months and I really had to just let it die. I decided for this month, instead of talking about the books in the order that I read them, I'm gonna talk about the books that I rated lowest to most liked. And the first one is The Third Gilmore Girl, and this is by Kelly Bishop. This is Bishop's memoir of her life. Very little of it actually focuses on her time on the Gilmore Girls. If you watched Gilmore Girls, she played Emily, Lorelai's mother, and Rory's grandmother. I loved her character on Gilmore Girls, and I think I will always love her character, even after reading this and considering it maybe my worst book of the month. This is one that I have very complicated feelings about because I just felt like this was so passively told, and I wonder if I would have felt differently if I was reading the physical copy. I listened to the audiobook and Kelly Bishop's narration was not my favorite. It was pretty dry and like matter of fact, and there were moments in the audiobook where you can tell that she's trying to be funny and it just comes across so poorly. I also felt like there were some moments that were really dramatized in the audiobook that didn't make sense for the content. And my bigger qualm with this book is really that it just doesn't go deep enough. This is a lot of passive explaining what happened in Kelly Bishop's life and not really reflecting on it, giving emotional depth to it. There was just no inner reflection that I found from this, which is what I personally enjoy finding in memoirs. It was very surface level, which is just not for me. I gave this one 2 stars. I think I would definitely lower it to like a 1.5 star because this is quite literally the worst memoir I think I have ever read. The next book was equally a disappointment because it was my second Simone St. James book, and that is the Book of Cold Cases. This was one that was unfortunately a little too similar to a book that I already read in January, and this was just so poorly done in comparison to that. So this is the story of a woman who has, I think it's like a true crime podcast, and she interviews a woman that was suspected in the 1970s, I believe, of these murders that happened, and they couldn't really ever prove that she for sure did it. So this journalist starts to interview her and kind of form a relationship with her, and she starts telling her really the story of her life. I think that the big reveal in this was revealed way too early, and the rest of the story was just so easily put together. Like the puzzle pieces perfectly fit. There was no real tension. Everything felt very predictable. Also, there are supposed to be paranormal elements to this that I think were really lackluster. They didn't incorporate well into the story, and they weren't explored in any meaningful way. The story just felt very rudimentary to me, and I was getting very tired of reading on and on and on about something that I felt like was so obvious to the reader. I think I gave it like 1.5 or 2 stars, and I kind of question about where I should go next with Simone St. James books, because I really did enjoy The Sundown Motel, but I'm noticing that even though her books are pitched as paranormal mystery, I don't think they're very successful in tying in paranormal aspects or elements into the mystery storylines. So I want to read more by this author to really form a better opinion on their work, but I also am really hesitating now because this just highlighted a lot of things that were little irritations in the Sundown Motel, but now I see like a kind of bigger problem with. So yeah, if you have recommendations for Simone St. James or like paranormal mystery that you think might be a little bit better, I would love to hear recommendations or your thoughts on that. The next book that I have to talk about is one that I saw a lot of people say they either loved it or hated it, and I feel very confused about what I was supposed to take away from it. So I think I'm more in the hate camp, but that also feels so intense for this book. That is Ghachar by Vivek Shanbhag, and this was translated from the, I believe, Kannada by Srinath Perur. This is the story of an impoverished family that gains a little bit of power and fortune, and the story kind of explores how they slowly become corrupt with this. I think this is one where it was just too short for me, and I never really felt fully engrossed in the story or attached to the characters, because most of the characters were incredibly annoying people. I think that there are some interesting themes being explored here in terms of wealth inequality, power dynamics. Also, there's a through line of the story that I won't talk about because I'm kind of afraid it would be a spoiler. But again, there were these interesting elements there, but they just never came together to weave this more intricate web for me. Think that I understand the ending, and that still didn't really wow me in any regards, which a lot of reviews that I read said that the ending was like the game changer for them, and I definitely could not relate to that. After that one, I finally concluded the Rebel Blue Ranch series by Lila Sage with Wild and Wrangled, and I am kind of sad that this was the end of the series, because I honestly think that this book should have been placed earlier in the series. I guess I don't understand why this was the finale book. I think that Wes and Teddy's book would have been a better finale, and I think that this one following Cam just didn't have the emotional impact for me. I also felt like for so much of the book, Cam and Dusty were really background characters that were not fleshed out, that were not incorporated that naturally into the plot line. And I think that this book could have been more impactful if it was like a third book in the series, where they're characters that you start to incorporate in more. I think their storyline could have played out more also in Teddy and Gus's book if this were the final book in the series. Yeah, I had a lot of problems with this, mainly because I just think as a second chance romance, it was a very hard sell for me. I think that the storyline in the past that we get was pretty superficial. Like it felt very much like insta love in the past. There didn't feel like an emotional depth to it. And then we get this storyline in the present day where we eventually find out the conflict that happened in the past, and it feels so immature. And then yet there's like almost a repetition of this conflict in the present day that felt like, okay, there's no growth from these characters, there's no development of them, they are still these like teenagers that just can't get their shit together. And I was really frustrated by that, because I think like in a book like this, especially with these characters specifically, with the life that they have lived from the past that we're given of them to the present that we're actively experiencing their lives with them, there needed to be some type of major growth, and it just didn't feel like that was happening. And the kind of conflict that happens in this proves that to me. My last real complaint about this is that I felt like the pacing was really off in it as well. In comparison to the other books, this felt like a speed run through this relationship, through the like couple themselves, and the brief bits and pieces we get of their lives and how their lives are progressing through this book. And so even though there are parts of this that I enjoyed, and I really enjoyed Dusty and getting to know a little bit more about him in this book, I just wasn't sold on the story here. The next book starts the like official middle of the pack for books for the month, and this was a poetry collection called Winged Witnesses by Chisom Okafor. I actually really enjoyed this, and even though I rated it 3 stars, I would highly recommend this one still. This is a poetry collection that is ruminating on a lot of different themes, primarily living with a chronic illness, complicated relationships with both faith and family. And I really connected with a lot of the poems in this, especially the ones ruminating on these complicated relationships with faith and living with chronic illness. I thought that those really impacted me the most personally. I really liked the style throughout this, and structurally I felt like it flowed very well and was very thoughtfully organized, which is what I really consider in looking at poetry beyond do I resonate with the themes, is what do I think about the collection as a whole and how it has been organized. And I think that this was very well done. I definitely will keep an eye out for this author in the future because it is a poetry style that I just really enjoyed. Even if it wasn't the most impactful in terms of like every single poem really resonating with me or causing this very emotional response. Next up is the Kamogawa Food Detectives. This is by Hisashi Kashwai, translated from the Japanese by Jesse Kirkwood. This was a in real life book club that I'm participating in and kind of co-running. This was our pick for January, and this was a nice, lighthearted read. I think it definitely falls into that stereotypical category of Japanese cozy fiction. And this was a lighthearted story of this father and daughter that run this like detective agency where they recreate these meals from people's lives. I wish there was more mystery in this. I wish that there was more exploration of how they kind of constructed these meals, but I really did like the cute storyline to this. The characters were very sweet. I thought that there were some really beautiful passages and scenes talking especially about grief and nostalgia that I really enjoyed. This is not a series I will carry on with just because I was not that engrossed in it, and it was very episodic. Like, that is just not my personal favorite because it's a little bit too formulaic. But I still found it to be a really nice lighthearted read, especially as throughout the month I was reading some heavier reads in between this. After that one, I picked up Artificial Condition by Martha Wells. This was continuing on with the Murderbot series, and I enjoyed this one. I liked meeting some new characters in this, yet I felt like this was very obviously a filler book. I mean, it was only the second in the series. The plotline also in this one was a little too formulaically similar to the first one, so it was very middling. Again, these are my 3-star reads for the month, so nothing that really stood out, but was okay, enjoyable even. And the last one in this kind of category, I would say, is The Joy of Movement by Kelly McGonigal. It's a nonfiction book that is all about the ways that movement can benefit our lives. Major focus in this is on like the feelings we get from movement, the sense of community you can construct and things like this, processing mental health things as well. I don't want to talk too much about this one because I have some like future video plans kind of related to this topic. So yeah, I'm just gonna say that it was an average read and I have more thoughts coming at a later point for this. The last few books I have to talk with you about are really more like 4.5 and higher books. I didn't really have one that was like a solid 4 stars, and the first one I want to talk about is The Only One Left by Riley Sager. I have only read, I think, 1 or 2 of Riley Sager's books before, and this one was really shocking to me how much I enjoyed it. This is actually thematically very similar to the Book of Cold Cases, where we follow a young woman. In this case, she's a nurse who is helping an elderly woman who like was accused of murdering her entire family many years ago. And she forms a relationship with this patient and they start kind of talking about her life. This was such an insanely fascinating book. The first half of it was really slow for me, and it's much more about building up this kind of unsettling atmosphere, this tension. It reminds me very much of like a gothic book where you are really focusing in on the atmosphere. There's this creepiness that is underlying the story that just like pulls you in even deeper. And I think that this was really successful in doing that. The last quarter of the book was a wild ride. There's so much intense emotions and scenes that are happening. There was a really epic conclusion that definitely requires a suspension of belief, but I kind of loved it. I think that this really felt like a movie to me, almost in a sense. I really hope it is adapted into one because it was such a wild ride of a story that I really enjoyed. And I was really surprised by how engrossed I was in this one because, especially after that first half, I was like, I think this is going to be a middle of the road kind of book for me. But wow, was I completely taken aback by how much I enjoyed this book, how much fun I had with it following along. And yeah, it was definitely a real thriller mystery for me. The second to last book is actually my last translated book that I'm going to talk about, and that is Notes of a Crocodile by Miaojin, which was translated by Bonnie Q. And this book, I understand now why this is such a beloved classic. This is a queer classic that was written in the 1990s, I believe, in Taiwan. The author is Taiwanese, and oh my gosh, this book has so much yearning in it. It's really just this story kind of told almost in diaries of this young woman in her 20s. It feels very autobiographical, but I don't know if it is really autobiographical. And so you're given these bits and pieces of this woman's life. Along with this, there's this allegorical story of crocodiles. And this was just so beautifully interwoven together. The writing style in this is just amazing. I did a lot of research after reading this book because I was feeling like there were some things that were going over my head, and I was really so intrigued by certain like structural choices that were made with this. And I found out later that the author was really heavily inspired by indie filmmaking, and I think that this really informs a lot of the thematic nature of this story. It is a story rich with like so much behind it, and intentionality behind the words, the organizational choices in this, the allegorical story that the author is really pushing throughout this. It was a book that I felt like I was never ending my research on, and just falling more and more in love with as I was, learning more about it. Since finishing the book, I have really enjoyed learning more about both the author and her inspiration for this, and the kind of interpretations that people have had about the book, what it represents to them, or what they believe about like certain scenes. It's a book that I've just been really enjoying doing a deep dive on, and I think it's a really beautiful piece of work. I definitely understand why so many people rave about this as a like fundamental classic, and I really believe that. Like, I think that this is a book that there's so much like nuance to it. There's so much that you can learn and explore from reading this book. I'm really glad that I finally prioritized reading this. That is definitely a tie for my favorite book of the month, along with the next book, which is such a wild tone shift, because the next book and the last book that I want to talk with you about is The Mark of Athena by Riordan. This is the third book in the Heroes of Olympus series. I have been really enjoying my time with this series. This had a lot of moving parts to it. However, I think that the storylines in this one were more focused on interpersonal development of relationships between characters instead of so much like plot, which kind of feels insane because there's a lot of plot in this book for sure. However, I really enjoyed this look at how certain characters' storylines were intersecting, how kind of new friendships are forming in this. I felt like it was really easy to keep track of characters and their stories through this book, even though there are a lot of subplots. I really liked the character work in this. I think that this kind of shift in tone that Riordan has been doing with the Heroes of Olympus series has been not only necessary in terms of continuing on this world building, but also really necessary in creating much stronger characters who have more nuance at this age group of, being on the higher end of like young adult. This one was really also good at like not focusing on just solely fleshing out the storyline for the next adventure, but really digging deeper at characters and their motivations and emotions. It just makes me really excited to see where this series is going to go, because I've been loving it so far, and I cannot wait to continue on with that one. But I'm on a very long hold list at the library, so we will see. But that concludes all of the books that I read in January. I would love to hear your thoughts on these books below, or what you read in January, how your reading year started off. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Happy reading. Bye.